At 11:00 at night, my wealthy husband's daughter shoved a list of household rules into my hands and ordered me to become her personal servant. By sunrise, she believed she'd already won. The first thing I noticed wasn't the two oversized suitcases. It was Emily's face. She looked exhausted, not sleepy, exhausted in the kind of way people become after carrying disappointment for far too long. Then she looked at me, and whatever softness had been hiding there disappeared. "Dad said we're moving in," she announced before I had a chance to say hello. Her husband, Brian, gave me an awkward smile as he struggled to pull the heavy luggage across the hardwood floor. "I'm sorry about the hour," he said quietly. Emily ignored him. Instead, she pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse and pressed it into my hand. "These are just a few house rules." I unfolded it. Breakfast at 6:00 sharp. No greasy food. Fresh sheets every week. Scrub our bathroom every night. Hand wash our work clothes. No maids. No help. Then she folded her arms across her chest and looked me up and down. "Since you're living off my dad anyway," she said with a faint smile, "you might as well earn your keep." The hallway fell completely silent. Brian looked embarrassed. Richard had already gone upstairs after taking his evening medication, completely unaware that his daughter had turned our front entry into a battlefield. I looked down at the paper again, then back at Emily. "Okay," I said simply. For just a second, she looked confused, almost disappointed. I think she'd expected an argument or tears or maybe for me to complain to Richard before she even unpacked. Instead, I stepped aside. "The guest room is ready," Brian quietly mouthed. "Thank you." Emily rolled her suitcase past me without another word. I stood in the hallway listening to their footsteps disappear upstairs. Only after the bedroom door closed did I let out a slow breath. No, I wasn't angry. I was wondering how much pain someone had to carry before kindness started looking like weakness. The next morning, my alarm rang at 5:00, old habits. I'd always enjoyed having quiet mornings before the world woke up. By 6:00, breakfast was already on the dining table. Scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, whole grain toast, turkey sausage, coffee for Richard, tea for me. Emily came downstairs expecting, I suppose, to find a nervous housekeeper waiting for instructions. Instead, she found me placing the last bowl of fresh strawberries onto the table. "There's no peanut butter," I told her gently before she even sat down. "Richard mentioned years ago that you're allergic." She blinked. "I am." Clear's throat. "I know." That was all I said. Breakfast passed almost entirely in silence. When everyone had finished eating, I cleared the dishes, loaded what could safely go into the dishwasher, and asked one of our long-time housekeepers to take a delicate wool coat to the dry cleaner before she left for the day. The cotton shirts would go into the washing machine. The silk blouse would be washed by hand. Common sense had always seemed more useful to me than blind obedience. After everything was done, I went upstairs. I changed into a soft blue dress, brushed my hair, put on a little lipstick, and carried my favorite novel onto the back porch. The spring sunshine had just begun warming the garden. Richard walked outside a few minutes later carrying 2 mugs. "I brought your tea. And your coffee," he smiled. I remembered. We sat together without saying much at first, just listening to birds and turning pages. Finally, he looked over the top of his book. "So what do you think Harper Lee was really trying to say in Chapter 4? I laughed. "Oh, Richard, you've been waiting all morning to ask me that." He grinned like a schoolboy. Inside the house, I noticed Emily standing behind the kitchen window. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at her father, watching him laugh, watching him relaxed, watching him happier than she'd probably seen in years. And for the first time since she walked into our home, I wasn't sure whether she hated me or simply didn't understand me. The funny thing is, Richard and I never set out to fall in love. If someone had told me 2 years earlier that I'd marry again after losing my first husband, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. Life had already surprised me enough. I was content with my little townhouse in Charlotte, my job managing the public library on North Tryon Street, and the quiet rhythm I'd built for myself. Every Saturday morning, I'd volunteer at a children's reading program. Twice a month, I'd cook lunch at a nearby group home for foster children. It wasn't an extraordinary life. It was simply one that felt meaningful. Richard entered it almost by accident. The first time I noticed him, he was sitting in the same leather chair near the library's history shelves every Tuesday afternoon. Always alone, always with a different novel. One week, it was To Kill a Mockingbird. The next, it was Steinbeck, then Hemingway. He looked like the kind of man who had spent decades making decisions and had only recently discovered he finally had time to think. One afternoon, I walked over to return a stack of donated books. "You've read that one 3 times." I said, nodding toward the worn paperback in his hands. He looked up and smiled. "My wife loved it." There wasn't any sadness in his voice, just quiet affection. "I suppose reading it again makes me feel like she's still arguing with me about the ending." I laughed. "Did she usually win?" "Always. That was our first conversation. 10 minutes, nothing more." Weeks later, I was helping prepare lunch at St. Mary's Children's Home. Hair tied back, apron covered in flour, trying to keep 6 energetic kids from sneaking cookies before dinner. When I looked toward the serving line, there he was, Richard. He was helping unload boxes of groceries from a charity truck. He saw me, smiled, then simply waved. He didn't interrupt, didn't come over, didn't make the moment awkward. Later, one of the volunteers whispered, "That's Richard Morgan. His foundation donates here every month." I hadn't known. A month after that, I saw him again at a community book festival downtown, then at a food bank, then at a fundraiser for literacy programs. Eventually, I laughed and told him, "Either Charlotte is the smallest city in America, or you keep following me." He chuckled. "I was about to accuse you of the same thing." Neither of us was chasing the other. We simply kept ending up in places where people were trying to make someone else's life a little easier. Looking back now, I think that was what first drew me to him, not his success. Certainly not his money. It was the fact that after building houses for 40 years, he'd reached retirement and decided the only thing he wanted to build now was a better community. Months passed before he ever asked me to dinner. Even then, it wasn't fancy, just barbecue from a little family restaurant outside Matthews. Halfway through dessert, he admitted something that made me laugh. I almost didn't ask. "Why?" "I wasn't sure if you'd think I was too old." I smiled. "Richard, I'm 52. You're 68. We're both old enough to know that good conversations don't happen every day." He reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "I've spent 20 years learning how to live without someone beside me." He looked into my eyes. "I think I've finally learned that living without loneliness isn't the same thing." That was the beginning. Not fireworks, not grand speeches, just 2 people who had each carried grief long enough to recognize peace when they found it. I had no idea then that someone else believed my presence would steal the only family she thought she had left. People often imagine that marrying later in life is easier. It isn't. By the time you're in your 50s or 60s, everyone carries history into the room with them. Mine came wrapped in old memories. Richard's came in the form of a daughter who had lost her mother at 15. Her name was Emily. The first time Richard told me about her, we were sitting on a bench overlooking Freedom Park after a charity walk. He stared across the lake for so long that I finally asked, "You're worried about something?" He nodded. "I failed exactly one person in my life." I frowned. "I don't believe that." "I do," he sighed. "When Linda died, Emily was only 15. He rubbed his hands together before continuing. "I thought the best thing I could do was keep working. I figured if I built the company bigger, if I made sure she'd never worry about money, I'd be taking care of her." I already knew where the story was going. "I wasn't there," he whispered. "I was in meetings. I was on job sites. I was on airplanes. I kept telling myself we'd spend time together next month, then next year." He looked down. One day I realized she'd grown up, and I had missed most of it. There wasn't self-pity in his voice, only regret. "I don't think she ever stopped loving me," he continued, "but I do think she stopped believing she could need me." I reached over and gently rested my hand on his. "You can't rewrite those years. I know, but I can stop wasting the ones I still have." That conversation stayed with me long after we married. Richard never spoke badly about Emily, not once. He defended her even when she wasn't around. "She's stubborn," he'd say with a smile. "She got that from me." So, when Emily called one evening to say she and Brian had hit financial trouble, neither of us hesitated. Brian had recently lost the management position he'd held for almost 9 years when his company downsized. At nearly the same time, Emily's small interior decorating business lost 2 major contracts. Within months, they were buried under mortgage payments, credit card debt, and bills that kept arriving faster than they could pay them. Brian hated the idea of moving in with us. Richard told me later that his son-in-law had argued against it for days. "We're adults," Brian had insisted. "We'll figure it out," but Emily wouldn't hear it. She told her father she missed him. She wanted to be closer. She wanted them to spend time together again. Richard believed her. So did I. Looking back, I think part of what she said was true. She really did miss her father. She just didn't know how to come home without bringing all her resentment with her. The first week under our roof became a strange routine. Emily kept finding reasons to test me. She'd ask for something in a tone that sounded more like an order than a request. I never argued, but I never became her servant either. One afternoon, she held up a silk blouse. I said all my clothes should be hand-washed. I examined the fabric, then pointed toward another pile. This one absolutely should be. Then I smiled. But these cotton t-shirts, I nodded toward the laundry room. The washing machine was invented for a reason. She stared at me. You didn't do exactly what I asked. No, I did what made sense. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to argue. Instead, she grabbed the shirts and walked away. From the doorway, Brian watched the whole exchange. When Emily disappeared upstairs, he quietly shook his head and muttered just loudly enough for me to hear, I honestly don't know how you stay this calm. I smiled. Practice. But the truth was, I wasn't trying to win Emily over. I was simply refusing to become someone I wasn't. It took Emily less than 2 weeks to realize something she couldn't explain. No matter how carefully she watched me, she couldn't catch me pretending. If I'd been putting on an act for Richard, surely the mask would have slipped by then. Instead, every day looked almost exactly the same. Monday through Friday, I'd leave for the library by 8:30. Wednesday evenings, I hosted a community book club. Saturday mornings belonged to the Children's Reading Circle. Twice a month, I still cooked lunch at St. Mary's Children's Home. Richard often joked that I stayed busier in retirement age than he ever had running a construction company. The truth was, helping people wasn't something I scheduled. It was simply how I'd learned to live. Emily, however, was still searching for proof that I wasn't as genuine as I seemed. One Saturday morning, she wandered into the kitchen just as I was packing a casserole into an insulated carrier. Where are you going? St. Mary's again? I smiled. The kids are expecting lasagna. She frowned. You actually spend your weekends doing that. I enjoy it. She gave a little shrug as if she couldn't understand why anyone would volunteer without getting something in return. After I left, Brian stayed behind to help Richard replace a loose fence board in the backyard. When I came home a few hours later, I found Brian standing in the garage looking frustrated. He was patting every pocket of his jeans. You okay? I asked. My wallet, I had it this morning. I can't find it anywhere. He looked embarrassed. It has every credit card we still have. Richard immediately offered to help him search. So did Emily, though she sounded more irritated than worried. Nearly 20 minutes later, Brian sighed. I must have dropped it somewhere. I'll call the bank. Before he reached for his phone, I remembered seeing something earlier. Without saying anything, I walked to the small table beside the front door. His wallet was exactly where I'd placed it after finding it near the driveway. I think you're looking for this. Brian stared. You found it this morning. You didn't even open it. I smiled. It wasn't mine. He took it slowly. Everything was still inside. Cash, cards, family photos. Nothing had been touched. Emily watched the exchange without saying a word. That evening after dinner, Richard and I carried our tea onto the back porch. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard looked over at me. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you hurt by what Emily said the first night? I knew exactly what he meant. The list, the orders, the accusation that I was living off him. I shook my head. No, he studied my face. Not even a little. I smiled into my teacup. Honestly, every time she gets angry, I don't see an angry woman. He waited. I see a little kitten soaked in the rain. Richard looked puzzled. You know how frightened kittens puff up all their fur? They hiss, they scratch, they try to look dangerous. Not because they want to fight, but because they're terrified someone will hurt them again. He didn't interrupt. I think Emily is like that. She's carrying an old wound. People with wounds don't always ask to be loved. Sometimes they push love away before it has a chance to leave them. Richard lowered his eyes. That wound was probably me. I reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. You loved her. You were just grieving, too. You didn't know how much she needed you. He swallowed hard. What if it's too late? I smiled softly. I don't believe love has an expiration date. Sometimes it simply needs someone patient enough to stay. Then I added the thought that had lived quietly inside my heart ever since I'd met Emily. Every child deserves at least one grown-up who refuses to give up on them. Neither of us noticed the upstairs bedroom window or the figure standing silently behind it. Emily had heard just enough to realize that, for the first time in her life, someone was trying to understand her instead of defeat her. Emily never mentioned what she'd overheard on the back porch. Not that evening, not the next morning, not even a week later. If anything, she became quieter. She still kept her distance, but the sharp comments came less often. Instead of looking for reasons to criticize me, she seemed to be watching me almost as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. I didn't bring it up. People change because they're ready, not because they're cornered. Life settled into a rhythm again. Richard spent his mornings reading on the porch before tending to the vegetable garden he'd insisted on planting after retirement. I worked at the library during the week and came home just before dinner. Brian had picked up temporary contract work while continuing to apply for permanent positions. Emily was still struggling to rebuild her interior design business, often working late into the night from the upstairs guest room. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home to find the house unusually quiet. Richard was in his study. Brian hadn't returned from work yet. Emily sat alone at the kitchen island staring at her laptop. She didn't even notice me until I walked in. "Tough day?" I asked. She closed the computer a little too quickly. "I'm fine." That answer usually meant the opposite. I simply nodded and headed toward the refrigerator. A few minutes later, I placed a mug of chamomile tea beside her. "I didn't ask for tea," she said. I noticed you've had 3 cups of coffee today. You always get headaches after the 3rd one." She looked up sharply. "How would you know that?" I smiled. "Because every time you rub your left temple exactly the same way." She unconsciously moved her hand toward her forehead before catching herself. For a second, I thought she might smile. Instead, she quietly picked up the mug. "Thanks." It was the first time she'd ever thanked me. It was small, almost whispered, but I heard it. A few days later, Brian found me watering flowers on the back patio. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He leaned against the fence. "Why are you always so patient with us?" I laughed softly. "I'm not patient all the time." "You hide it well." I thought about that for a moment. "When I was younger," I said, "my grandmother used to tell me something." "What?" "Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." I looked toward the upstairs window. "I found that's usually true." Brian nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I judged you." I thought Emily was right. I thought he hesitated. "I thought maybe you married Richard because life would be easier." I smiled. "My life was already good before Richard. It just became happier after I met him." Brian looked down, embarrassed. "I believe that now." Before I could answer, Richard stepped outside carrying a basket. "Who's coming to the farmer's market with me?" Brian immediately volunteered. "I'll drive." The two of them left laughing about tomatoes and homemade peach jam. I watched them disappear down the driveway. When I turned around, Emily was standing on the porch. She had heard everything. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she looked away and said quietly, "Brian likes you." "I like Brian too." "No," she murmured. "I mean, he trusts you." There was something fragile in her voice I'd never heard before. Not anger, not sarcasm, just uncertainty. I smiled gently. "Trust takes time." She gave the smallest nod. Then she surprised me. "So does healing." It was only 6 words, but for the first time since she had walked into our home dragging those 2 giant suitcases, I realized the walls around her heart had begun to crack. I just didn't know how quickly they would be tested. Richard's heart attack happened on a Thursday. There was nothing dramatic about the beginning. No warning speech, no movie scene where someone clutched their chest and collapsed. He was simply trimming rose bushes in the backyard while Brian tightened a loose railing on the deck. I was inside folding laundry when I heard Brian yell, "Richard!" The basket slipped from my hands. By the time I reached the patio, Richard was sitting on the ground, one hand pressed tightly against the center of his chest. His face had gone pale. Emily froze. She stood only a few feet away staring at her father as if her mind refused to believe what her eyes were seeing. "Dad!" Her voice trembled. Richard tried to answer, but another wave of pain stole his breath. Brian was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling 911. I dropped beside Richard. "Richard!" He looked at me. "The nitroglycerin." His voice was barely audible. I knew exactly where it was. Top drawer of his nightstand, 2nd bottle from the left. His cardiologist had insisted he keep it nearby after his first minor cardiac episode 3 years earlier. I ran upstairs, grabbed the bottle, and hurried back, one tablet under his tongue. "Pillow," I told Brian. "We need to keep him supported." Brian was already sliding a cushion behind Richard's back. Emily still hadn't moved. She looked completely overwhelmed. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. I reached for her hand. "Look at me." She did. "I need you to unlock the front door. The paramedics are coming." She nodded and finally moved. It gave her something to do. Sometimes that's all panic needs. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics loaded Richard onto the stretcher while I handed one of them his medication list, insurance card, and cardiologist's contact information. "You have everything ready?" the young paramedic asked. "I keep a folder by the front door." He nodded approvingly. That probably saved us several minutes. At Presbyterian Hospital in Charlotte, Richard was taken straight into the cardiac unit. The waiting room suddenly felt enormous. Brian sat quietly beside Emily. Neither of them spoke. When the nurse called my name to complete admission paperwork, I stood. "I'll be right back." Emily gave a silent nod. Nearly 20 minutes passed before I returned. As I stepped toward Richard's room, I heard raised voices. "Emily's, how you've changed since she came. You never had time for me growing up, but suddenly you have time for her. You trust her with everything." Richard looked exhausted. "Emily, no. You've replaced Mom." His heart monitor began beeping faster. The green numbers climbed. 88, 94, 103. Richard reached for his chest again. A nurse glanced toward the monitor. I walked into the room. Enough. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Emily spun around. For the first time since we'd met, I wasn't smiling. "I know you're hurting. I know you've carried that hurt for years. I've spent the last month trying to understand it." My voice remained calm. But this, I glanced toward Richard, who was struggling to breathe evenly. This isn't a little girl talking to her father anymore. This is a grown woman putting a heart patient under unbearable stress. Tears immediately filled Emily's eyes. "I didn't mean I know." I stepped closer. "But intentions don't change consequences. I've tried to give you grace because I believed your anger came from pain. It does. But today you stopped being a wounded daughter and became someone hurting a sick father." The room fell completely silent. Emily looked at Richard, really looked at him. His trembling hands, his frightened eyes, the oxygen tubing beneath his nose. Her own shoulders collapsed. She covered her mouth as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. For the first time, she wasn't crying because she felt abandoned. She was crying because she realized she had almost become the reason someone else suffered. Emily didn't come back into Richard's hospital room that afternoon. She couldn't. The moment the nurse closed the door behind her, she walked straight to the end of the hallway and sank into one of the waiting room chairs. Brian sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. From inside Richard's room, I could see them through the glass wall. Emily stared at the floor. Her shoulders shook every few minutes. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet kind of crying that happens when someone finally stops defending themselves. Richard was resting after the doctors stabilized him. His color had already returned. The cardiologist assured me the attack had been caught early. "He'll need to slow down," the doctor said, "and he definitely doesn't need emotional stress." I smiled weakly. "We'll make sure of that." After Richard fell asleep, I stepped out to grab a cup of coffee. Emily was still sitting exactly where I'd left her. She looked up as I approached. She began, then stopped. Words seemed impossible, so I simply sat beside her. For nearly a full minute, we listened to the hum of vending machines and distant hospital announcements. Finally, she whispered, "I almost made him worse." I nodded. "Honestly, you did." She closed her eyes. "I didn't mean to." "I know," her voice cracked. I waited my whole life for him to choose me." There it was. Not money, not the house, not jealousy. A little girl's heartbreak carried into adulthood. I looked at her carefully. "Emily, do you know what I think?" She shook her head. "I think 15-year-old Emily never got the chance to tell her father how lonely she was. Fresh tears rolled down her face. So 38-year-old Emily has been trying to say it ever since." She covered her mouth and sobbed. "I hated seeing him happy with you." "I know." I thought. She struggled to breathe evenly. "I thought if he had enough love left for you, then maybe he never loved me that much." Without thinking, I reached over and took her hand. "No, he loved you. He just buried his grief inside his work. He failed you, but failing someone isn't the same as never loving them." Emily cried harder. "I kept trying to prove you were pretending, I know. But every morning you'd remember something about me. My allergies, my favorite flowers, my clothes, my coffee. I didn't understand why." I smiled. "Because that's what people do when they care." She stared at me for a long moment. Then something inside her finally broke. "Not in anger, in surrender. I've been awful to you. You've been hurting." "No," she shook her head firmly. "I chose to hurt you. And you kept choosing kindness." I laughed softly. "I wasn't perfect. You didn't have to be." For the first time since we'd met, Emily reached across the space between us. She wrapped both arms around me and cried like a child. "I don't even know how to apologize." I held her quietly. "You just did." An hour later, Richard woke up. When Emily walked back into his room, she didn't rush to explain herself. She simply walked to his bedside, took his hand, and began to cry again. "I'm sorry, Dad. I spent so many years blaming you that I forgot how scared I'd be if I lost you." Richard squeezed her hand, then looked at me. His eyes were wet. Mine probably were, too. At that moment, I realized something unexpected. I hadn't won. Emily hadn't lost. The only thing that had finally surrendered was 23 years of unspoken pain. 3 weeks after Richard came home from the hospital, life looked surprisingly ordinary again. And maybe that was the greatest miracle of all. Richard followed his doctor's instructions for once. Morning walks instead of heavy yard work, less coffee, more vegetables. He complained constantly. "I've built bridges," he'd grumble. "Now my cardiologist won't even let me carry a bag of mulch." Emily would laugh. "Dad, you're impossible." It was the first genuine laugh I heard from her since she moved into the house. One Saturday morning, I walked downstairs expecting to make breakfast. Instead, I stopped halfway. Emily was standing in the kitchen wearing one of my aprons. The counter was covered with eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and what looked like several failed attempts at pancakes. She turned around looking almost embarrassed. "I wasn't sure how you liked your eggs," I smiled. "You'll learn." She laughed nervously. "I burned the first batch," I noticed, "and I may have set off the smoke detector." I definitely noticed that. Richard walked in just then. He looked from me to Emily to the disaster covering every inch of the kitchen. "What happened in here?" Emily raised both hands. "I wanted to make breakfast." Richard blinked. "You," she nodded. "For everyone." He looked at me with tears already forming in his eyes. Not because breakfast mattered, because he'd waited over 20 years to see his daughter smile inside this house again. After breakfast, Emily followed me onto the back porch. There was a small gift bag in her hands. "I bought you something." "You didn't have to." "I know." Inside was a beautiful leather bookmark. On it were engraved the words, "A reader lives 1,000 lives." "You always lose your bookmarks," she said. I laughed. "That's true." Then she took a deep breath. "I can't give you back the month I spent treating you like an enemy. No, I can't undo those words either." I gently shook my head. "No," but she looked directly into my eyes. "If you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life treating you the way you deserved from the beginning." There are moments when forgiveness feels like hard work. This wasn't one of them. I hugged her, not because she'd finally apologized, but because somewhere along the way she'd stopped seeing me as the woman who took her father's attention. She had started seeing me as someone who cared about her anyway. Months later, Brian found a new management position. Emily slowly rebuilt her design business. Eventually, they moved into a small townhouse across Charlotte, not because they wanted to leave, because they were ready to stand on their own again. Every Sunday, they still came over for dinner. Sometimes Emily cooked, sometimes I did. Richard usually insisted on washing dishes even though he was terrible at it. The first time Emily accidentally called me Mom, she froze. "So sorry," I smiled. "You don't have to apologize." She smiled back. "I wasn't going to." People sometimes ask me if I ever got revenge. I suppose I did, but not the kind people expect. I didn't defeat Emily. I didn't embarrass her. I didn't make Richard choose between us. The greatest revenge against fear isn't punishment. It's proving that love can stay even when someone keeps trying to push it away. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one that never hurts us. It's the one that keeps showing up until we finally believe we're worthy of being loved. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need that reminder today. And if you'd like to hear more stories about healing, forgiveness, and second chances, I hope you'll join me again.